thanks to everyone tonight for tuning in to this event sponsored by the Menard family, George Washington Forum at Ohio University. The forum is grateful for a newly announced gift from the Menard family, which will fund, among much else, a robust guest speaker series. Tonight's event is the first of the Menard family guest speakers program, and this event receives support as well from the Jack Miller Center through a grant from the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. I want to thank Tom Smith, the JMC, and especially the Menard family for supporting the forum's activities. Everybody listening tonight will have a chance to ask questions of tonight's guest, Matt Crawford. There's a Q&A function below. Type of questions in it. We'll try to get all of them answered that we possibly can. Tonight's guest is the only return visitor to the Washington Forum in the 11 years of operation. He's Matt Crawford. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Virginia. He was a physics major at UC Santa Barbara and earned his PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago. He's written 3 ravely reviewed books, 2009's Shop Class, A Soul Craft, An Inquiry into the Value of Work. Follow that up in 2015 with The World Beyond Your Head on Becoming the Individual in the Age of Distraction. And his latest book is Why We Drive Toward a Philosophy of the Open Road, which just came out this year. That's a book that might sound like a book about driving, but it's actually a book about human flourishing and along the way self-government. And I'll say up front, it's one of the best books I've read in the last 3 or 4 years, and my family is having me, tired of me telling them that they need to read the book, but they'll find it in their Christmas stockings when the time comes, if any more listening. So Matt, thanks for being here tonight and doing this. I just want to start you off with a question. So you like Volkswagen Beetles from the 1960s? I do too, and you don't really seem to like modern cars. So if someone's driving a 65 or 1963 Volkswagen Beetle, or they're driving a 2019 Honda Civic, what's the difference between driving those two kind of cars?
Well, obviously, in an old car, you feel the road a lot more. And to begin with, they usually weigh about half of what a contemporary car weighs. And also all the little mechanical vibrations aren't damped out. You're using direct mechanical linkages to control everything. So, the state of the road and the state of the car isn't being filtered through all these electronic aids, things like stability control and traction control. So, if you're on like a twisty road, if it's a fun driving type situation, the car almost becomes an extension of your body because your body is so involved in driving it. And, you feel like a cyborg when things go really well, or like an athlete. Suddenly you're an athlete because your bodily powers are being extended through what feels like a well-fit prosthetic. Whereas in a contemporary car, everything is kind of passing through these filters. So it's a more abstract experience. It's a lot more comfortable. If I had to do a 10-hour drive on the interstate, I'd definitely take a modern car.
Yeah. So roads, the interstate's a road. I think one of the things when I started reading this, people say, "Oh, cars." It's like cars congest roads, cars congest cities. I'm thinking of people who've been on the sort of program for Patrick Deneen, laments cars and roads and says that cars have deformed the way humans live. We live in these far-flung suburbs and we don't live in human communities. I take it you think that's maybe not exactly the way to think about it. What's your response to environmentalists and new urbanists?
I actually tend to agree with them. The car has completely shaped the landscape in the United States. And it's interesting, often the way people will think about it is that we've just gave ourselves over to the free market, and consumer choice has given us this situation that is not ideal for anybody because of the sprawl. But actually, if you go back to the early days of the automobile, it was very much a decision by policymakers at at the city and state level to design cities around the automobile, even before there were many. So it was a kind of bit of progressive kind of urban engineering, urban design, and very deliberate, which kind of complicates the story of it being a kind of stupid, libertarian failure to take the common good into account. It was just a different picture of the common good, and I think a lack of foresight, which is pretty typical anytime you try to plan things through kind of rational planning. But these are the cities we have, and so you can't, destroy them root and branch to make like a medieval walkable city. So given all that, the car is here to stay.
Planners gave us cars. Cars are here to stay, so we might as well figure out how to learn how to live with them. All right. This sort of second. So the new urbanists have one complaint about cars. Why don't we shut down streets and put coffee shops in the middle of them? And the COVID crisis gives us a way to do that. The other complaint though is, well, look, Crawford, these cars are just killing the planet, right? It's like we need these old cars, especially. We need cash for clunkers. We got to get all these old cars off the road. What's your take on that, right? The sort of environmental claim and the cash for clunkers program.
Yeah, the environmental logic of cash for clunkers programs turns out to be totally ass backwards, because
it's a technical term.
Yes, it is. As though melting down the 1970 Karmann Ghia that's parked out there, and which, by the way, gets about 35 miles to the gallon, to then what am I going to do? Buy a hybrid? That would be the green thing. So the hybrid is going to be, think about the energy flows and material flows across like 3 oceans to bring that thing into being. The smelting, the sort of coal-fired power plants at the car factory, and then the diesel-powered container ships to bring it over here. Throwing away serviceable, repairable old cars is like the least green thing you can do. But there's this kind of aesthetic of green that is offended by anything old, and just kind of facilely identifies, new tech with green. But if you sort of do a carbon accounting, old cars are the greenest things we have.
All right. So we love recycling, and we love saving old things, but we just don't, but not old cars. So we make sort of a weird exception for cars.
Well, there was the history of that's interesting, and I go into it in the book. In California, California invented the Cash for Clunkers program, and it was a bit of PR by Unocal, which is the refining company, but it got entered into the official story about, it was said that 10% of the cars are responsible for 50% of the pollution or something like that, and it simply wasn't true.
Yeah, large corporations known for selfless altruism. All right, so we have different driving on old car versus new car, and the urbanists and the environmentalists. Some things maybe think they might get off. So let's talk just about driving itself. You have this interesting and funny bit in the book where you talk about rats driving cars. And you relate it to human happiness. Tell us about rat drivers and human happiness. How do these two things go together at all?
Yeah, so there were some researchers at the University of Richmond who taught rats to drive cars. Like, I actually had a hand. I built the first joystick mechanism for the little rat paws. So what's interesting about this, rats have been taught to do things for 100 years. They figure big in psychological research. They're very intelligent animals, but this was a completely different kind of task. Instead of just hitting a button to get a reward in that classic conditioning of behaviorism, here the rats had to solve a problem, how to get from this part of the lab to that part over there where there's a Fruit Loop waiting for them. And so they sort of zigzag and are making these course corrections all the way there, sort of in the final trial of the experiment. So what this was thought to be a breakthrough in our understanding of what rats are capable of. And one of the researchers, Kelly Lambert, has demonstrated that when she does a lot of work with rats, when they are in this enriched environment that requires active problem solving, they're healthier in all kinds of ways. Their stress response, their ability to cope with various stressors is improved. And so the suggestion is that there's a big difference between being passively carried through the world and actively finding our way through the world. That seems to be, it's not just a human capacity, it's an animal capacity. And the sort of wider implications I draw from it is that, with driverless cars, the plan is to disburden ourselves of finding our way through the world by the exercise of our own powers. And so, we're going to become probably more like the depressed rats, because that's what happens with the standard lab rats who just live their life in a plexiglass box. They get depressed and anxious. So, and then there's other elements to this. I think finding your way through the world depends not just on a set of skills, but a disposition to do that. So to the extent that we're no longer doing that for ourselves, you're talking about an atrophy of certain skills and dispositions.
So one of the things you hear a lot from students on children is this word anxiety. It's the kind of it's a way of describing how people usually seem to be Gen Z. I haven't heard many people Gen X, and I'll say this in a kind of snarky way. I just don't hear a lot of people Gen X or boomers or maybe even millennials describe themselves as anxious and filled with anxiety. People who are Gen Z, younger seem to describe anxiety as being a feature of their life. So is it a reasonable inference from your sort of thinking about driving that actually being exposed to stress and to anxious moments, to really open-ended moments, actually enables for less fragile systems? It's not it builds a kind of resilience. Is that kind of how you think about it?
Well, there's a whole literature on just that, resilience as being something that arises from failure, and from coping with failure, and from exposing yourself to the risk of failure. And so in the book Why We Drive, I open with a story of riding a dirt bike through the woods. And so, I might be going only 10 miles, 15 miles an hour, but there's roots and rocks and tree limbs and, creek crossings and mud, and all this stuff is coming at you, and you just have to kind of deal with it on the fly. So it takes total concentration. And the reason I bring that up is when things go well, meaning I don't crash, and maybe I'm even pushing my skills a little bit and developing them, I feel elated. I feel somehow enlarged. But of course, it doesn't always go well. I've broken a lot of bones doing that. So then the question is, why do such a thing? And that was one of the questions I wanted to pursue in this book, is this hunch that risk is somehow bound up with humanizing possibilities.
Yeah. So resilience built by dirt, riding trails, um, learning how to driving in certain kinds of ways. You also talk about virtue being a skill. So virtue, not a disposition, but virtue is something that's active. How does how do you see driving or riding building virtue?
Well, yeah, we have to lower our sights here a little bit, but I do think so. Think about an urban intersection, especially in a place like Rome, where there doesn't seem to be any real rules that are actually being followed. It's a very chaotic looking scene, highly improvisational. And when I look at that, I see something that's kind of beautiful, namely a bunch of people who are cooperating. And so the ideal seems to be, let's make things flow rather than obey rules. And flow is this emergent property of a collective that happens only if everyone is paying attention and brings a disposition of flexibility to it. And I think that set of dispositions is also very much implicated in the democratic personality, for example, as described by Tocqueville. So he thought that it's in small bore practical activities like that people acquire the habits of self-government, as opposed to having a bureaucracy or some technology sort of solve all of our problems for us. So the ability to cooperate and solve problems together on the fly, he thought was at the heart of kind of the spirit of self-government. And I tend to think he's right about that.
So, yeah, I seem to think so too. But there's a technology coming down the way. I mean, it's already out there in limited doses, as you talk about in your book, and as most people know, and that's driverless cars, right? Or a car that will drive for you, like Tesla's doing this, and others are in the game. Have you ridden in a driverless car?
I haven't. I would like to. I know people who work on driverless cars, but I've never actually gone for a ride.
So people who do, what do they think they're doing making a driverless car? I mean, you have a vision of driving as, and we can talk more about it, but you have it's an active thing. It's something that makes you more human in certain circumstances. What are the people working on driverless cars? What do they think they're doing? Making us less human? I mean, is that
they're ushering in the future with a capital F, I guess. Yeah. It starts with FU, I guess.
Yeah.
No, I mean, obviously, if they were to pull it off, it'd be an enormous business. Of course, it requires a remaking of the infrastructure of transportation to sort of optimize the operation of the cars. You probably have sensors embedded in the roadways. You could imagine, the smart city is part of the whole picture of what is on offer in this vision of driverless cars. And it's really a kind of utopian, it's in the whole tradition of utopian urban planning, where the hope is to achieve sort of perfect order in the city. So I think of it as a terrarium of optimization. You probably, Google could make the trains run on time. They're pretty good at everything they do. But what you're giving up is having any kind of say over such a city. So the idea of democratic control over it is nowhere in that picture. You would have infrastructure that's designed and funded by some cartel of tech companies. So it doesn't sit very well with our liberal political traditions, that whole smart city vision. But to focus more narrowly on driverless cars, I see them as one instance of this wider shift in our relationship to material things, where the demands of skill and competence give way to a promise of safety and convenience. So, the thing about that is that when we become passive and dependent in that way, our skills atrophy from lack of use, including, I think, those skills, the kind of social intelligence on display at, say, an urban intersection. And of course, as our skills atrophy, this leads to demands for further automation, because you can't trust the humans to do the right thing. So there's a kind of all or nothing logic to it, a kind of totalizing logic to automation, where what you're doing essentially is trying to replace trust and cooperation with machine-generated certainty on the presumption that humans are incompetent. And I want to suggest that that presumption is a kind of self-fulfilling one because of the atrophy.
Yeah, and listening to it's also, it seems it's trying to remake not just human capabilities, but also remake, where and how people live. I was sort of looking COVID statistics in my zip code today just to kind of see what the turns out. So I live out in the country. Athens is a small little town. You've been here, maybe 30,000 people live here when students are here. There are 5,222 people, I think, live in my zip code. I looked at the zip code, the next one over, there's 689 people in the zip code, right? So I was trying to think, well, what does a driverless car look like in rural America, right? We're just thinking about, it's kind of hard to think how that is. It's an urban vision, isn't it? Not a.
Well, it's actually far easier to realize in a rural environment, because the city is such a chaotic and unpredictable environment. So if it's going to happen, it's long haul trucking would be the first area to do this. Now it's interesting in something like 30 states in the union, the number one occupation for males without a college degree is driving of some form, truck driving, deliveries, all that stuff. So if the driverless vision were to be realized, you're talking about a massive dislocation of the labor force.
Both of my neighbors on either side of me, Cheeseburger lives on one side, and Charles, who lives on the other, would be out of a job. They're both truckers doing it. So, no, go.
Well, so yeah, just this kind of massive dispossession and transfer of wealth is part of the picture. And if you're, New York City is an interesting case. Here, you're not talking about driverless cars yet, but that's a whole different story. Uber, we can get into that later.
Yeah. One of the, so it's interesting. It's just when we started talking about futurism that some of the questions started coming in from students in this. And so, and there are questions about sort of like inevitability but also just like the inescapability of tech. So I just want to put a couple of these to you that have emerged from students. One is, look, technology is just here. It's part of our life, right? We have phones, laptops, we're talking to each other by computers. And the person asks, well, okay, what tech should we do with and what tech should we do without, right? Why not have driverless cars? Should we not have phones? Should we not have these computers? How do you?
Yeah, this isn't an anti-technology argument. I am myself a technologist, as you might infer from the background here. So, I think in thinking about, tech, you have to put on a political economy hat. and think about these aren't simply options in a marketplace that you're free to choose or not choose. They tend to remake the whole landscape of possibilities. And that remaking, again, proceeds not so much through consumer choice that comes in at a certain point, but through a kind of outsized monopoly commercial power and close alliance with the government. A lot of the regulatory agencies are captured. Google, I think, is the number one lobbyist, has the biggest lobbying budget of any in the nation. So, to think that this is a question about technology itself is a little bit naive. I think it's about money, and usually there's a transfer of wealth involved, as we just mentioned with the dislocation of human drivers that we talked about.
Yeah. So, so the reasons to have, right? So you're pointing to the reasons to have driverless cars. There's a political economy reason. Some people say, what's the future? You can't stop capital F future coming, capital P progress. This is, and oftentimes you hear, and one of the questions that popped in the Q&A sort of, gets to some of this. So when you say, well, look, they're higher goods than just being able to drive your own car. And so, one of the people who wrote in here and said, well, look, some of these driverless technologies allow for less congestion in cities and mitigate and thus mitigate pollution. There's a higher good,
there's all kinds of, to fully realize the driverless vision, if it were possible, you would be talking about less congestion because the cars would be able to coordinate with one another and sort of predict one another's trajectories, which is actually what humans are pretty good at that kind of socially bootstrapped mutual prediction. That's what's going on at that crowded intersection. So, as far as pollution, if you really want to tackle that problem, you get into mass transportation, trains. I mean, to have a train of driverless cars going down the road together, like that's called a train. We invented that a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah. And the no need for those pesky train drivers either. They'll be able to retrain us, I'm sure, is something. One of the things that people that is, and you talk about this a lot in your book, one of the chief things that people point to about the virtues of driverless cars is, hey man, they're more safe. Why, Crawford? Why don't you like safety? I mean, what's the problem with being safe? Isn't this the highest good that we have, safety?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So right. So to be against safety, that's not a good career move. What are you, pro-death? So I talk about safetyism as an ideology. Now, it's also a kind of sentimental education that we've given ourselves, wherein the safer we become, the more intolerable any remaining risk appears. And I think that makes us more susceptible to claims made on behalf of safety, and not always in good faith. So like red light cameras I talk about in the book. These have sprouted up everywhere in the US. And of course, they're justified on grounds of safety. But there's a few investigative journalists who've taken deep dives into red light cameras in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and find that they actually increase accidents at those intersections. Excuse me, because of course people slam on the brakes when they see the yellow light coming. And not only that, but when the lights go up, the yellow light times are reduced because that creates more revenue because there's more infractions. So the point isn't, there's always been that kind of urban corruption that's not terribly interesting, but what I think is a little bit interesting, at least, is that Safetyism can become, it's used as a kind of lever of moral intimidation to forestall criticism or even scrutiny of what's going on, to sort of create a little more elbow room for bureaucrats to find ways to extract more money from people. So you can think of it as rent seeking that is based on collecting rents from perfectly reasonable behavior. We actually behave pretty well at intersections because we don't want to crash, as it turns out. And you can rely on that fact to do most of the work for you.
Yeah. So safetyism is a rent seeking, but also safetyism as a sort of reactionary imperative, not as it's reactionary. It's not progressive. Is that?
Well, in the what I was just saying about red light cameras, is a scam, is what it is. But it's a scam that has a moralistic kind of edge to it, right? Because to question the program is to display a callous disregard for human life.
Yeah. You have an interesting bit when you talk about the safety industrial complex. You end up talking at some point about road rage, and there's a bit where you say, like road rage, we get angry because we're actually not face to face. We have a tough time understanding what the person in the other car is thinking or doing, and then we lose it. And it made me think, is this what goes on? Is this the problem of social media too? In other words, are the problems that we encounter as humans on your reading ones where we are not face to face, we're not having face to face interactions, but we're having these mediated interactions with another? And how does road rage actually, you talk about flow, but road rage is a break in flow. Yeah. So how does that fit into your kind of bigger analysis there?
So yeah, in our cars, usually it's not the cars on the other side of the street that are provoking your impatience. It's the cars going the same direction as you, because they're the ones who are in your way. And so, yeah, you can't tell where their attention is directed, the other drivers. You can't tell where their gaze is directed. So you're making all kinds of interpretive leaps, trying to figure out their behavior with very little information, which is very different than our, what we evolved for, which is a more face-to-face kind of interaction. And sometimes that can spiral into this mutual assured misunderstanding. I think that's what road rage often is. And not only can you not read their intention, but it's very hard to make yourself understood. We have very little expressive capacity from within the car. I mean, you can honk. That's about it. So that I take to be the flip side of the more positive possibility, the one I invoked earlier with the flow and mutual accommodation in a complex urban driving situation. And what's going on there is, as I mentioned previously, a kind of a capacity for mutual prediction in which we're modeling one another's behavior, kind of by putting yourself in their shoes. And so I think that the ability and the inclination to do that, to get outside your own head, that disposition, again, is implicated in the kind of political culture we have. And you mentioned social media. I think that's a nice parallel where, again, you can't see the person that you're slamming on social media. You're very enclosed in your own, just your keyboard and your own thoughts. So it stands to reason that would facilitate a kind of solipsism. I think the car too tends to encourage solipsism. It's you're enclosed in your own private property. And yet you're sharing the road with all these other people. So it's almost in microcosm, the whole problem of liberal society, where we're sort of hyper individualistic. And yet we have this kind of longing for solidarity. So that whole, tension seems to be replicated in driving this. Yeah.
So safety is something people talk about. There's you have this really fun bit about talking about drifting, which I knew nothing about. Lane splitting I'd seen and heard of, but drifting wasn't one. And so play, you talk about the role of play and driving but play in our communal life.
Yeah, so in the book, I take some excursions into these different automotive subcultures. I just went around to check them out and see what was going on. So yeah, drifting, a demolition derby, what else? A hare scramble race, desert racing, off-road desert racing. So one thing that sort of stuck out is this spirit of play. It's competitive. It doesn't serve any purpose. It's, there's no utility to it. So it's sort of outside the logic of economistic thinking. And I was helped very much for kind of interpreting what I saw by this Dutch historian named Johan Huizinga, who writes about play as the basis of civilization. And he says the essence of the play spirit is this combination of hostility and friendship. So think about, boasting matches or stylized insult trading, like a rap battle. Yeah. He found play in ritualized combat and competitive dances. He goes all the way back into archaic societies. So when you're playing, you're in a state of tension and uncertainty in these competitive scenes, and you're putting something at risk. There's usually an element of danger. So, and that very much fit what I saw in these grassroots motorsports scenes. And that it was interesting to me as a contrast to the kind of technocratic spirit of rational control, kind of trying to make sure everything is tidy and controlled. So it's like it's this element of the human spirit that is beautiful to behold.
Yeah, it's funny. I was reading that part. One of the, we're all in this infernal COVID and various stages of lockdown, and as much fun as I've seen any group have, weirdly, just in the middle of like August, I think it was, driving down the street, the fairgrounds in Athens County is right, actually near the center of town. It was a long line. I thought, what is going on here? And there was an enormous line to get into the fairground because somehow there was going to be a demolition derby. And you could see people walking and cars banging up against each other. And I thought, that is the people walking in looked relieved. They looked free. Yeah. It looked fun. And I thought, man, I really wish I could go into that. My daughter was not, super pleased about the thought about going to a demolition derby. I had to take her someplace. But that is this kind of notion that it's purposeless, right? It has no purpose that is utilitarian, but it has a deep purpose, right, in it.
Yeah, Huizinga talked about the human need to fight. Yeah. And he said that the sort of imperishable need of man to live in beauty is connected to this need to fight. It's a very unusual perspective and illuminating, I think. Yeah, so the demolition derby, it's, there's just, they're crashing into each other and there's fire and smoke and explosions. And it's like an Iron Maiden concert circa 1983. But instead of stage effect, it's the real thing.
I can, yeah, no, yeah, I'm with it. So fighting the need for this, and I'm thinking, a skeptic, an academic skeptic, maybe especially, listening to this, going, "Oh, Crawford, you're just describing what all you're describing is just some sort of toxic masculinity, right? This is just play. It's just guys peacocking and running into you." But you have one of the most fun bits of your book is to use a phrase you have, is ode to redneck women. And I just wanted to talk about that. I read it and I thought, oh, I know those. I know exactly what he's talking about. But I wonder if you could talk about that, because you have an idea. You work out an idea about what strength actually looks like.
Yeah. So a hare scramble is a motorcycle race through the woods on dirt bikes. So I went to this hare scramble in Central Virginia, and I was surprised. There was a lot of women racers, and they just line up and race. They just go for it, and there isn't like a culture of trying to encourage women or empower them in some way. So there was a lack of bureaucratic kind of solicitude that was making this happen. Most of these women grew up in motorcycle families. They started riding when they were little, and it just seemed totally natural. And that contrasted, in my mind, with what you see on, say, college campuses, where there's this concerted sort of program of trying to, not just college, but organized youth sports, really from childhood on, to sort of empower young women and make them feel equal. But it seems to have this perverse effect that's really evident in college, which is a sexual paranoia and brittleness and fragility that really did contrast with the toughness of the women I saw at this motorcycle race, because it's dangerous. I mean, I don't want to do it. So something about the unsupervised nature of it stood out, because so much of life takes place in these supervised settings, whereas here there was no referee, no judge to declare a false start or something. People going down in the first 100 yards is mud, and that's just tough luck. And I don't know. It was, again, it was just a bracing scene and kind of beautiful.
And a lot of slagging off of guys who weren't very good at riding from the women. I seem to remember in that part of the
There
book.
was one. I heard this one mother berate her son who was a little bit hesitant to get in there, and I won't repeat the language here on your podcast.
Yeah, it's a family program we've got here.
It was salty. She was basically telling him to man up. Yeah. And that's not the kind of thing you often hear in polite society, where, oh, that's a gendered thing, and we have somehow a bad conscience about indulging in gendered demands or stereotypes or something. But
yeah, mom giving the hard lessons.
Yeah, so it was. I guess one thing that was interesting is that in that, I don't know, to draw sort of an overly broad caricature, I think in the more redneck scene, women want their men to be manly, and that also contrasted with more polite precincts where there seems to be a kind of message of, I don't know, androgyny or sexlessness.
Yeah. So play is a word you don't often hear, and you might not expect to find in a book on driving, but one of the words that appears again and again and again, and it's a concept that really seems to matter to you, is sovereignty. And I guess I just wondered, I have a couple questions about this, and some other questions in the Q&A I want to get to as well. But why does sovereignty matter right? And and why does it relate to driving? What do you take it to be?
Well, I guess if we start with the idea of self-government, so self-government, you can take it in a very kind of individual sense of, being in command of yourself, being able to control your own car, for example, and control your own impatience with other drivers. But it kind of shades into something more social. So if you're, for example, leaned into a blind curve on a motorcycle, you're trusting that there isn't a truck coming around that has crossed over the double yellow line. You're extending a presumption of competence to some hypothetical truck driver who may or may not be there. So that's a moment of real trust. And I think being willing to extend that presumption of individual competence is one basis of social trust. So sovereignty would mean a kind of collective self-government. And I talk about the London taxi drivers, who are a guild, really. They're the training to become a London taxi driver is one of the most demanding professional exams of any kind. It usually takes 4 or 5 years of constant study, walking the city or riding it on a scooter and mapping it out, finding the most efficient routes. So it's an enormous investment. And so they've had to fight Uber. So Uber comes in with the mapping software, and the gig drivers of gig drivers who are not invested in the job. They're sort of indifferent. They're probably as lost in London as you or I would be. It's an extremely confusing city. It's a medieval city. So here's a foreign ride-hailing firm that has just come in and basically sidestepped local control. So it does have an imperialistic character to it. And actually the revolt of the London taxi drivers against this Uberization of London fed into the Brexit moment. The motto of Brexit is take back control. So in trying to fight off this California firm that probably employs a tiny number of people, basically extracting those profits, it seemed to be a case of political sovereignty or economic sovereignty, but it so clearly tied into the Brexit mood of, wait a minute, can we take back control or can't we?
Yeah, just for work, go to London about once a year to do research. And the one thing I will say about this book that will change in my life is I'm not going to be riding Uber, and I'll go back to riding cabs, paying a little bit more.
Those guys know the city like is unbelievable. They can tell you about every little thing going on there.
Yeah. You mentioned the word maps. Why? And you talk about it in the book in relation to Google Street View. Why do we need maps, and how do maps and how does Google Street View undermine sovereignty?
Well, you need a map if you're not a local. So map making has been an instrument of empire, for 1,000 years. In other words, if you want to have complete control over some territory and be able to control it from the imperial center, you have to have reliable maps. So that, because if you don't, let's say a tax collector comes from the imperial center to some little city, or someone to conscript soldiers, they're going to need a local guide to get them around. So the sort of illegibility of the city, geographic illegibility to outsiders, provides a kind of membrane, semi-permeable membrane to preserve local control. So, Street View is an effort to map the entire world. And there's also something called ground truth, where it's not just streets, but every nook and cranny of the planet is to be fully known and mapped and made accessible to anyone, anywhere, which means there's no longer any advantage to being a local resident. So it's, given I'm getting that spiel about map making and empire from a political theorist named James Scott. I think he's at Yale, maybe.
Seeing like a state is
seeing like a state, yeah. So Google kind of starts to look like an imperial state in its aspiration to map the entire planet, and so that's all knowable from afar. So the distinction between local and anywhere, somewhere, and anywhere gets erased.
So so in the early modern period, there were company states, like the East India companies. Some people think of it as a company state. At the forefront of making driverless cars are big tech companies. So Google, you talk quite a bit about Google in this. How do you, in the story that you have, how do you see these companies? Because you've written about it in your previous book, The World Inside Your Head, or Outside Your Head. How do you see sovereignty and these big tech companies and desire to map the world?
Well,
put it another way, if Carl Schmitt, something like sovereignty is he who can declare the exception. Who can declare the exception with Google and
well, these entities are, they're more powerful than most governments, and maybe even more powerful than our own government. We're kind of seeing these platform firms set the terms of political discourse. They decide who gets kicked off the platform and who doesn't. So if you want to talk about election meddling, it's like the whole kind of space of political speech is managed or administered by people who are in no way accountable to citizens, right? It's a kind of clerical authority, sort of priesthood, where who knows, what their goals are. So that's not a picture of self-government. That's a picture of a weird kind of I don't know what to call it. What would you call it?
Tell me, I'm not. Scary, right?
Yeah.
One of the things you have, like, so it's a book about driving, right? But there's a lot of political thought and political thinking going on there. And you talk at some point about populism. It's a long 4-letter word for the educated elite, and you note. You mentioned it just a bit with London cabbies who have to have the knowledge, capital T, capital K, to be able to get their license, but also the yellow vests in France. That real pushbacks against Western states that have come often, not always, but often from drivers. But you have this interesting bit where you describe populism as the ultimate enlightenment moment. It's not an anti-enlightenment moment. It's the ultimate enlightenment moment. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, obviously, it's a democratic movement. We have this weird tendency to elide the term liberal democracy as though they're the same thing. So if something doesn't comport with the sort of pieties of the liberal cosmopolitan consensus, we call it anti-democratic, even if there's a majority behind it. So there's that problem. But I guess there's an interesting epistemic dimension to this. So in the book, I have a chapter called Folk Engineering, where I'm talking about people who do stuff like this, hacking cars and building stuff and sharing knowledge on these forums. These internet forums are crucial and the YouTube tutorials, all that stuff is great. So this isn't a blanket rejection of the internet by any means. But the point there, one point is that these are people who are departing the realm of proprietary knowledge systems. So for example, if you want to replace parts in your car, normally what you do is you go to the dealership and you find a parts number, and you need the parts number to get the part. And so it's this kind of closed bureaucracy of knowledge, and it's very hard to break that system. If you go in and said, if you go in and say, what is the center to center spacing for this caliper bracket or something, they won't be able to tell you. So what gearheads are doing really is they're departing that entire system, and they're using dimensions, they're measuring things. And that means you're talking about a universal language now. So that struck me as precisely the story we tell about what enlightenment was. It was getting out from under kind of guarded priestly knowledge class and kind of opening up knowledge by kind of pegging it to universal things, such as a standard of measurement, which is completely transportable. So I think of this as a digression from, so this would be a kind of engineering populism, I guess, folk engineering, I call it. Yeah.
It made me think when you were talking about that. So there's a country where, at least within the last 15 to 20 years, a lot more people have started to drive than ever drove before, and that's China. Right. So you talk a little bit about motorcycling in India, but China seems to be something. So I wonder how your analysis, if you have to sort of work out or speculate driving in China. I mean, have you thought about that at all, or is this just an out of left field question for you?
Well, I was once in Beijing, and I was leaving. I'd been over there a month, mostly in Tibet, and so I was on my way to the airport, and there was a traffic jam. And I had recently heard about a traffic jam in Beijing that lasted a week. So people were like starving to death because they're trapped, like completely trapped. And so I started to panic. I ended up taking all my luggage, getting out of the cab, and throwing it over a fence. I had a lot of stuff too. Throwing it over a fence and then climbing over the fence. So now I'm on this frontage road and flagging down a guy who took me to the airport. So that's my Chinese driving story. But you had some more serious.
No,
questions.
I was wondering if driving is, in your view, something that helps with self-government.
Oh.
Right. Then if you have a nation full of
Right.
new drivers in a non-self-governing regime,
Yeah.
is driving a threat to authoritarian regimes, I guess is.
That's an interesting question. Probably not would be my guess. But if I take my own argument seriously, should it be somehow? I guess, how would that work?
Maybe they'll want driverless cars. I mean, I don't really know. I just did. Something came to mind.
No, go ahead.
You talk about smart cities. The smart ass in me wonder, what does a dumb city look like? But what are these smart cities, and how do driverless cars fit into that? And what is a smart city is it a self-governing city?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a city of where everything is optimized. And so there would be very concrete benefits if, trash collection, fire, deliveries, the allocation of street capacity, all that could be managed by an urban operating system, is the phrase you hear. But again, the cost is a complete lack of democratic control over any of that. Now, maybe we shouldn't be too sentimental about democratic control. I lived in Chicago for about 10 years, and Chicago politics are, is a contact sport. And
I grew up in Louisiana. I have no illusions about.
Yeah. So,
one of the things there's question in, so like one of the things maybe that could happen in a smart city, Matt, is that you could have more biking and walking. And wouldn't biking and walking be mobility free will? I mean, what do you?
Yeah.
What I mean.
So
is there a lot of? Are you able to bike and walk in cities where there are lots of drivers?
I don't. So here, people tend to assume that in the smart city there will be less congestion of cars. That would likely not be the case if we go with driverless cars, because now you're able to do other things while driving. So people are going to be commuting in from much further distances, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a kind of murky picture there of progress on every front. But yeah, walking, bicycles. There's a guy named Ivan Illich who wrote about bicycles, comparing them to cars. So he has this idea of a major tool, which sounds like an insult you would call somebody. But a major tool, well, the other thing that he contrasts that with is he called tools for conviviality. So these are things like a bicycle, things that are immediately accessible, don't require expert knowledge, and they facilitate some activity that kind of puts you in the world with other people. And he laments that, a city like Los Angeles is getting around by foot is basically impossible, just the way the city is built. So for him, the automobile is a major tool that is one that kind of alienates us from the surroundings. And I think he's right about that. For the most part, I think the smart city vision, driverless car vision, would be an even more major tool, in the sense that everything is connected. Everything's talking to one another. Everything's a smart device, or Internet of Things. It means that there's all kinds of stuff taking place that is nowhere in your own field of perception or control, or your own field of action. You're just kind of a passive, test particle in this world. Now that's an overstatement, because in fact, the idea here is that the city would become like a smartphone. That's an analogy that's actually been made by some of these sort of futurist urbanists. So a smartphone, all right, so a glassy facade that opens up into a cornucopia of apps that are tailored to my needs, without any effort on my part. So, if we take the kind of smartphone business model as a prognostication of what that's likely to look like, it would be, the smartphone is basically a device for harvesting your attention, packaging it and selling it. So if that economic logic of the attention economy were to escape the screens and come into the real world, I'm not sure what that would look like, but it's not given 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 the way Silicon Valley operates, it's not a gamble I really want to take.
Yeah, I was thinking, listening to you also, talking about driving in LA. That old Jerry Jeff Walker song, LA Freeway. It turns out, like, I was thinking, like, what is the dream of driving? It's about getting on the open road, right? I mean, that is part of driving. So a couple questions come in, sort of interesting, but one's just picking up a tension in something you said. So the Guild of Taxi Drivers is one that's really hard-won knowledge, and it takes 4 years if you're lucky to get through it. And as you point out in the book, I mean, you have to basically go and hawk about 200 grand in pounds to do this. It's really hard. But they drive around in automobiles, right? That the person said, have part numbers and part dimensions. So you just wondered, do you think, the question is, compare the Guild of Taxi Drivers to the automotive industry that requires part numbers and not part dimensions to identify products. What do you make of that tension?
Can you spell out a little? I'm not
completely certain. I think that I think what the questioner is interested in is, on the one hand, in the guild, the taxi drivers have to use all this folk knowledge to it, but then the things that they're driving around in are things that are these.
So there's always some level of dependence on things that you don't understand. So I do a lot of welding and machining here, but I'm not smelting, and I'm not a miner digging ore out of the ground. There's a whole pyramid of people, further, or pyramid is not the right, people further back the chain. So yeah, we're all dependent on people that we never see, and systems that we don't understand, and that's to think otherwise would be a fantasy of complete autonomy, I guess, or being self-sufficient in a way that no human being is.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Couple questions to sort of get you out of here, just building on some things from the Q&A. So futurism suggests that the future is inevitable, right? But that certain technologies are inevitable. Driverless cars are going to happen. The smart cities are going to happen. Standing against them is standing against progress and the future. But then you have, as we talked a little bit about, you talked about, well, there are these people who sort of try to stand athwart history and yell stop, to borrow a line from Buckley. And these are people who are often populists. So I guess there's a question, there that's like, well, what about, lots of populist movements are exclusionary and authoritarian. Maybe something to get you to think about. But I guess I also wanted to know, do you think that that driverless cars are inevitable? In other words, can the demos stop this, right? And what if the demos wants it, right? I mean, that's the other question.
Okay, well, I guess first the actual sort of factual picture is that people in the Valley seem to be quite bearish on driverless cars at this point. The engineering challenges of finding your way through a chaotic urban environment have turned out to be far more challenging than was first thought. So the time horizon has been pushed way back. When I first started writing this book in 2016, they were talking about, by 2020, we'd be surrounded by driverless cars. So obviously there's a lot of hype that hasn't, that they've kind of throttled back on. But, if you go back to 2016, the inevitability talk was everywhere. And I think one way that futurism tends to work is that you offer some picture of the future that you want to come about as though it was a prediction, because that's a way to get venture capital interested and journalists interested who want to be on the side of whatever's the next thing. So you get a kind of critical mass of groupthink surrounding it. And the assertion of the inevitability also serves to demoralize any kind of opposition, because it's inevitable. So, the history of futurism is a rather embarrassing one in general. So I think that's still the case.
And probably not surprisingly, like the vaccines, I love you hear the news sometime on a Sunday night and the news breaks just before the market opens on a Monday. So futurists, it seems, tend to own stocks too. So just get you out of here on this, right? So we've talked about a book about play and sovereignty and driving and hair racing and Redneck Women, but it's a really learned book. It's not just you visiting a bunch of motocross subcultures. It's actually thinking pretty deeply about what's human flourishing. So the people who are listening to this tonight, what are 3 books that you'd say, if you want to think better about the world in which we live, think more clearly about the world in which we live, here are 3 books that I'd suggest to you. What are Crawford's books?
Well,
aside from your own.
If you're going to read 3 books, mine should not be on that short of a list. There's a thinker named Michael Oakeshott, who's an English philosopher, and he wrote a book titled, it's a collection of essays titled Rationalism in Politics. So in the title essay in there, he describes this rationalist as a kind of character type that's very recognizable as the sort of technocratic rational planner who has a vision that he wants to impose upon the world. And it's a really illuminating portrait of a tendency that it seems to be a permanent tendency in modern societies. And it's a kind of a devastating picture of that. So that would be one book. Another, which we mentioned, is Johann Huizinga. The title of the book is Homo Ludens, which is Latin for, man, the player. So this is an historical study of different civilizations and the role of play in them, and arguing that it's the play spirit that is at the heart of kind of civilizational progress. So that's a really arresting and beautifully written book. I mean, beautifully translated anyway I think it was written in German, even though he's Dutch. Third book. Boy. To pick up on the populism theme, Christopher Lasch, The Revolt of the Elites, is a fascinating book where he, by the revolt of the elites, he's talking about basically elites releasing themselves from any ties of obligation to the nation or to any particular political community and become sort of free-floating, cosmopolitan free agents. And so the effects of that are he draws the whole thing out in the psychology of it. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I will suggest to our listeners, might not be the only book you read, but if you're looking for a really interesting and fun and rich book, Why We Drive: Toward a Philosophy of the Open Road. Really appreciate you coming on tonight, this afternoon, your time, Matt. And
it was a pleasure. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah. For those of you who found tonight's show interesting, on Monday, the 30th of November, Jacob Greigel from Catholic University of America will be here to talk about American foreign policy after the election. In the meantime, thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. And I hope you all have a good night.
All right. So long.
Thanks. So long.